Hello, my name is John Michael Warren, and today I'll be talking about Islamophobia in a post 9/11 America. In this podcast, I'll be talking about 9/11 and how it influenced Islamophobia in hate crimes, discrimination in the workplace, new airline security, other races, and finish with modern Islamophobia. To begin, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, Islamophobia is the unreasonable dislike or fear of and prejudice against Muslims or Islam. On September 11, 2001, 3 al-Qaeda terrorists aboard 3 hijacked passenger planes carried out coordinated suicide missions against both towers of the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, killing all on board and another 2,700 plus. A 4th plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after the passengers tried to retake the plane, killing everyone on board. Many speculate that 4th flight was heading for the White House, however no one knows for sure. All in all, there is 2,996 deaths and 6,000 more injuries. As you may guess, there is obviously tons of mourning and grief. However, the attacks did help unite the nation by demonstrating their patriotism and nationalism. Quote, some flew the American flag from their porches and car antennas, others pinned it to their lapels or wore it on t-shirts. Sports teams postponed games, celebrities organized benefit concerts and performances, end quote. This sense of ultranationalism and patriotism helped contribute to frustrated people singling out a scapegoat, and with that came a 67% rise in anti-Muslim attacks after the 9/11 attacks. In a pre-9/11 America, Islamophobia was hardly an issue. According to the Pew Research Center in 2000, there was a total of 12 total anti-Muslim assaults, and in the following year they skyrocketed to 93. In the first 11 days of September of 2001, 3 anti-Muslim attacks took place. On September 12th, there was 21, and an average of 7 or 8 daily for the rest of the month. Like I said before, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, Americans were ultra-patriotic and nationalist, and many of them extremely frustrated. As a result of this new nationalism and frustration, there was a huge spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes, which would never return to its pre-9/11 numbers. Nearly 600 incidents happened in the first 10 days after 9/11. 500 people reportedly mobbed a Chicago mosque, refusing to leave until the police arrived. There was also a couple of men murdered as well, one of them not even being Muslim. FBI Director Robert Mueller said over and over again that vigilante attacks and threats against Arab Americans will not be tolerated, but threats and harassment would remain prevalent in Muslim neighborhoods and mosques. And even after the huge spike in hate crimes fell, America would never be the same. According to the FBI's data, from 2002 until 2014, the number of anti-Muslim crimes receded to a numerical range between 105 to 160 annually. This number was still several times higher than the pre-9/11 levels. Along with the more serious hate crimes, including assault and homicide, there's anti-Muslim intimidation. It is defined by a reasonable fear of bodily harm and is the most common hate crime. In 2001, there were 296 victims of anti-Muslim intimidation. As you can see, after 9/11, America became a somewhat dangerous place for Muslims, and life became uneasy and stressful. In fact, 50% of Muslims said it was harder to live in America after 9/11, according to Pew Research Center surveys, which brings me to my next point. Discrimination in the workplace. According to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, American Muslims have experienced increased job discrimination since 2001. Complaints alleging anti-Muslim bias in the workplace numbered nearly 800 for the year ending September 30th, 2010, up about 20% from 2008 and showing a nearly 60% spike from 2005. In fact, Muslims account for just over 21% of religious discrimination cases, despite comprising less than 1% of the population, end quote. To prove this bias, 6,000 similar fictitious resumes were sent to California employment firms with names identifiable as white, Latino, African American, Asian American, and Arab American. The name Heidi McKenzie, white, received the highest positive response rate, 36.7%, and Abdul Aziz Mansour, the Arab American, the lowest at 23%. After the 9/11 attacks, it became much more difficult for Arab Americans to get white-collar jobs due to discrimination in the application process, and even if they did get the job, they were often subject to anti-Muslim discrimination in the workplace. Along with discrimination in the workplace and hate crimes, new airline security measures often targeted Muslims. These 9/11 attacks brought a new light to the problems that plagued the airline industry security. As a result of the attack, security was sent into hyperactive reconstruction, strengthening all security and creating the TSA among many other securities acts. Quote, the TSA was developed in order to improve the quality of airline security following the September 11, 2001 events. Shortly after the TSA was developed, roughly 65,000 new federal personnel were employed. end quote. According to Jim Abrams, some of the short-term goals included, quote, criminal background checks on 750,000 airport employees, the presence of more law enforcement, the screening of all checked baggage with whatever means available, including x-ray machines and hand inspections, the placement of more air marshals on flights, and more passengers will be pre-screened, with more cross-checking with FBI and other watch lists for suspicious passengers, end quote. However, most of these new security measures, especially the pre-screening and cross-checking, was normally biased, and eyes seemed always to be on someone that is Muslim. Mychal, a professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and author of the Headscarf Controversy, Secularism and Freedom of Religion, says, unfortunately, the Global Terror Network created racial profiling against Muslims. Due to the Global Terror Network's new cross-checking with the FBI and other watch lists for suspicious passengers, Muslims are often targeted in the airport and could not get away from it. In the racialization of Islam in the United States, Islamophobia, hate crimes, and flying while brown, Craig Considine writes, because many U.S. citizens perceive them as threatening and inferior, American Muslims endure regular expressions of hostility in public places, particularly U.S. airports. Selad interviewed 48 South Asian and Arab Americans about their experiences pre- and post-9/11 in Chicago and the Dallas-Fort Worth area between 2009 and 2012. Her research found that the association of Islam with terror, violence, and the oppression of women contribute to a process of racialized governmentality at airports, which conveys the message that American Muslims are a threat to national security and require careful monitoring and surveillance. This process of racialized governmentality regularly targets Muslims at U.S. airports and has led to many American Muslim men and women being treated with suspicion. Although many real Muslims were being targeted, there were lots of men and women that were not Muslim at all that were being targeted. Quote, Muslims are not the only religious group who might be subjected to extra screenings at airports because of what they wear. Sikhs who cover their heads, typically with a turban for men and long scarf for women, also often draw extra scrutiny. Unfortunately, Islamophobia was found in people that were not even Islam. Balbir Singh Sodhi, a Sikh man, was murdered in Arizona after the gunman wrongly assumed he was Muslim because of his turban, right after the 9/11 attacks. Non-Muslim and non-Sikh, too, have been impacted by racial profiling and the racialization of Islam. Guido Minzio, a decorated Ivy League economist from Italy, was removed from an American Airlines flight after a passenger expressed concerns after he began writing math equations in a personal journal before the plane took off. Minzio, who was described as having, quote, dark curly hair, olive skin, and an exotic foreign accent, quote, was taken off the plane for questioning regarding him being a terrorist. Quote, his experience highlights the way that internalized racial bias against Islam and Muslims can lead to the perception that U.S. Muslims pose a security threat, said Considine. And still, in recent years, a decade and a half after the 9/11 attacks, many Sikhs feel that no safer in the country primarily because of the continued confusion between Sikhs and Islam. Ultimately, linking such features as Muslimness means that people who are not Muslim are also subject to the violence as a result of the racialization of Islam, said Considine. Modern Islamophobia is now worse than what it was during the 9/11 attack. During Trump's 2016 campaign, he spoke very derogatively about Muslims, a fact which most of his followers upheld themselves. A founder of the Council on American Islamic Relations, said the president's failure to speak out against white supremacism and extremism as in the aftermath of neo-Nazi-led violence in Charlottesville in August, which left one woman dead, had the impact of allowing such views to become mainstream. It's worse now than ever, even after 9/11. He has empowered and mainstreamed white supremacy and bigotry, Mr. Hooper said. After 9/11, bigotry was under the rocks and hidden. Now these bigots are out in the open and saying they are proud of their bigotry, end quote. Failure to speak out against Islamophobia has empowered a whole new generation of Islamophobes, outnumbering the post-9/11 numbers. Islamophobia has become this decade's communism. In the decades of the Cold War, there was a huge stigma around communism and communists themselves. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, that stigma shifted to Muslims in the U.S. Quote, Muslim terrorist has replaced communist, and echoes of McCarthy can be heard. Popular conservative websites and books argue that McCarthy was on the right track and that liberals who once hindered the struggle against communists now hinder the fight against terrorism, end quote. On the other side, there are people that believe the government are using methods close to the 40s and 50s Its, quote, modus operandi was to create lists of prescribed organizations and investigate, prosecute, and fire individuals based on their affiliation with those prescribed groups, says David D. Cole, a constitutional law professor at Georgetown University Law School. Quote, it has been revived in the post-9/11 era. The suspicious associations have changed. People don't care if you get the Communist Party's Workers magazine, but they would care if you got the Hamas newspaper. Quote, after the 9/11 attacks, the nation was forever changed. The loss and tragedy of 9/11 needed a scapegoat, and with that came Islamophobia in many forms, such as huge spikes of anti-Muslim hate crimes, work discrimination, and finally, new biased airport security regulations. Not only were Muslim people targeted, but also innocent people that looked Muslim were being affected, tainting our country's claim to diversity. Now, under Donald Trump's presidency, these unprecedented statistics are coming back almost 2 decades later, and the nation must act. Thank you for listening to Islamophobia in a post-9/11 America. I'm your host, John Michael Warren. We out.